Stephanie Rost is an assistant professor in the History Department at Queensborough Community College. She's earned her BA in Berlin and her master's in Vienna and her PhD out at Stony Brook. And prior to joining Queensborough, Stephanie Rost was the 2015 to 2017 postdoctoral fellow at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, and the 2017 to 2019 visiting assistant professor at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University. Welcome to the conversation, Stephanie.
Thank you, Michael.
Stephanie, you're an archaeologist, right? And an anthropologist, and you have a strong background in ancient languages. How do those three things work together?
Well, I would say they work together as an historical archaeologist. Because, I mean, you probably were familiar with the US historical archaeology, that they basically try to research the aspects that records or textual documents do not cover. And so actually what period I'm working on, or what my specialty is about, I'm doing basically the same. So my specialization is more in archaeology, but I also use texts in order to enrich the reconstruction of the past. And anthropology is obviously the understanding of humankind or social organization, and that is obviously what applies to past and present.
So this background that you have in ancient languages, what languages are you most familiar with?
Mostly Sumerian.
Right, and how is that represented? Is there an alphabet? Is it more pictorial?
So it's cuneiforms. I don't know if you are familiar with
I remember that from school, yes.
So basically you imprint with a reed stele symbols into a clay tablet. And they're called cuneiform because the imprint that this reed stele makes is that of a wedge. So it's a combination of wedges that represents one sign. And it's not alphabetic, but it represents syllables. And obviously, originally it were pictograms, but then over time, they became more abstract and became signs, and then from first representing words to then representing syllables that can actually then pull together as words. So this is so the alphabet really comes a lot later.
You are conducting research in Iraq at the moment, right? And from what I understand, you're reconstructing some ancient history to learn how the early states and societies there organized themselves. Right. Can you share with us a little bit about, well, not a little bit, a lot about what you're doing in Iraq? How often do you go? And what is it that you do there on the ground?
Okay. So this project is very early in its phase, you can say. Like, we had so far only 2 field seasons, but we hope to go back this fall. So we had 2 seasons in 2018. And what the project is, it's an archaeological survey. So it's not an excavation where you go to one site and excavate the site to find houses and artifacts. But basically what I do is I go to archaeological sites and pick up what is on the surface. So pottery, sometimes we do find artifacts like, bull figurines or some stone objects. And basically what I'm doing is, like, first of all, to record, okay, it's an archaeological site, but also by dating the artifacts that I find on the surface, I determine how long they were occupied and which historical periods or in prehistory. And based on that information, there's a lot of things you can do with that. You can write a settlement history, describe how, in that case, southern Mesopotamia, so South Iraq, was settled through time. What were the demographic changes? Did populations rise or fall? Where were the settlements? But in my case, what I'm specifically interested is finding sites that date to a very specific period. So this period is called the Kingdom of the Third Dynasty of Ur. So it's a territorial state that dates to about 2000 BC and lasted for 100 years. And this period is very interesting because it yielded an enormous amount of textual records. And most of these textual records are of administrative in nature. So these are records where people wrote down how many people did they employ, how much did they spend in paying wages, any kind of economic transactions. So it's extremely detailed for a very short period of time. And of course, they also mention sites or places. They mention settlements, towns, and cities. And for this period, we don't know where these places are. We know them only from the textual records. And that really impacts how we understand these economic transactions, because it really makes a difference whether point A and point B, which exchanged with each other, were 100 miles apart or only 10 miles apart. Or, for example, what I really studied was how they did irrigation, which canals they cleaned. So I cannot reconstruct based on the textual record where these canals are, or how long they were, or how big they were. And so for that, I need archaeology. I need to find the archaeological sites that are equivalent with the place names that are mentioned in the text. And so basically what eventually, hopefully, will come out of that is a reconstruction of the historical geography of this area during the kingdom of the Third Dynasty of Ur. And this is then the framework in which we then better understand the records that talk about the context in which these economic transactions took place.
So there's no map that you can use. So you're taking evidence that you find in one place and checking it with an archaeologist colleague somewhere else and seeing if they match up. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, that is actually, I'm trying to create a map, basically where cities and towns were located basically 5,000 years ago, and where the canals were located, because they are all described in the text, but obviously we don't know where they are on the ground.
The text that you referred to, are you able to read that text? How much are you able to glean from that?
I actually, for my dissertation, I analyzed all the texts that deal with irrigation management. And so, yes, I can read them.
What sort of volume of data are you working with, and how is this data recorded? Is it on tablets? Is it on paper? What's it on?
Yeah, it's on clay tablets. So it's basically like small, like there are different variations. So they're very tiny tablets of this size, which
Right.
record the labor and material expenditure for one single project. So let's take an example. If a work group goes out and cleans a canal, then it says X amount of workers for one day cleaned this and that canal. And then like some administrative information of names of officials, and sometimes you have also the month. What we also have are summary tablets, and these are larger, they can be that big. And these summary tablets basically summarize the work that has been supervised by an individual official. So all these small tablets are collected and then basically written down, and then there's a summary of how many work days or how many labor hours this supervisor supervised within a given year. And these are the type of tablets. We have, of course, also other genres. We have letters, we have also literary compositions, hymns, and these kind of things. But the bulk of these records that come from the kingdom of the Third Dynasty of Ur is administrative documents.
I want to go back to those little records.
Yeah.
Those little chips, those ancient chips of information.
Yeah.
You mentioned them being on the antiquities market and in museums around the world. Are there any of those artifacts here at New York City museums?
There is. Well, the Metropolitan Museum has one, but also, which is really nice, like the one example I always show, because it's really nice and neat, comes from the New York Library. The New York Public Library, they have also a couple. It's really strange how these things got sort of distributed. Like libraries would buy a couple of those, and obviously mainly museums, because they can curate them, but also university museums or universities have sometimes tablet collections. So there's a big one at Yale University. And there was also a big one at Cornell University.
Where specifically in Iraq? What would it be around Baghdad? What modern day cities would we correlate to the work that you're doing?
It's also a city called Al Rifai, which is probably not very well known, but it's basically between Nasiriyah. Maybe people are familiar with Nasiriyah or Basra in the very south of
Basra.
Iraq.
Mhm.
And in between, you can say Nasiriyah, Basra, Iraq. Al-Qud would be the better, would be more accurate, but because it's a little bit further south on closer to Nasiriyah and Basra than it is to Baghdad, for example.
So you yourself, you're not doing the excavation and finding these tablets yourself. Is someone bringing them to you, or how do you access them?
The texts, you mean?
Yeah, the little pieces of.
Yeah, no, so these obviously, they were either excavated, a lot of them come from the antiquity market, and now they're all distributed all over the world in museums.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and what now, obviously, with digital databases, they are all put in a single database. There are actually two of them with a photograph, with transcriptions, meaning basically transcribing them into our alphabet. You have the cuneiform, but you also have a transliteration, what it's called. And so that's how they are accessible today, which made a huge difference. Like before, you had to actually travel to the museums and see the tablets. The curator had to basically get them out of the museum storage or magazines, and then you would sit there and study them, and either, or publish them and based on publications. But nowadays, we can basically search a database for key points and then pull out all the records that deal with a certain subject.
The research that you're doing today has been built on years of research that you've done. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done previous to this project?
To this project, I dealt already mainly like with this with basically focusing on irrigation. So that was my main focus, looking at how Sumerians in this case managed the Tigris River to irrigate fields, but also to organize river navigation. So that was my main focus also of my dissertation. So I looked at these ancient records, pulled out all the information or all the text that dealt with irrigation and river transportation, and then came up with a description of what they were doing.
And they were doing a lot of engineering work. Were they really taking control of their environment and shaping it to their own needs?
Yeah, they did. I mean, not to the magnitude, obviously, what we see in the late antiquities, where you have a construction of really long canals, like 50 kilometers or more. I think that at that point, which is 2000 BC or earlier, like the irrigation systems that you deal with are fairly small. But nevertheless, they do build canals approximately 10 kilometers long, with obviously the gradient. But what I did find actually the most interesting aspect of it is that they do really manage the rivers. So Euphrates and Tigris are flooding rivers. So the river level really does change in the river. And that has an impact on river navigability, like how much you can actually transport on boats and how fast you can go from place A to place B. And what I found out was that they actually built like basically weirs or barrages in the river to prop up the water level. So to keep the river navigability for longer. High, so that actually you can use it, especially during the time when the water levels would be low.
Let me ask you, because growing up and going to school, I certainly learned about the Tigris and Euphrates and cradle of civilization and so forth. Is that where your interest in ancient civilizations began? Can you take me back to your history and tell me when you first developed your interest in this work?
So I would say I was always exposed to the ancient Near East. I grew up in a fairly religious household. We were very familiar with the stories of the Bible. We had Bible comics or graphic novels of the Bible, and they're also depicting, obviously, Mesopotamia, especially the New Babylonian kings and people that the ancient Israelites came in contact with. And I was always very fascinated by that. And I think that sparked my interest in the Middle East in general, but particularly the ancient Near East. And then I did not right away study Mesopotamian archaeology, but prehistory, thinking I would have better employment. I mean, archaeology is not necessarily the field that you will have secure employment. But anyways, so I had always had Mesopotamian archaeology as a minor, but liked it from the get-go much, much better than prehistory. I found it so much more interesting. And then I switched majors. That's when I did my bachelor's. And that's basically what I did from there on. Mesopotamian archaeology. We focused in Germany very early on our subject matter.
Yeah.
So I was specialized from a very early age on Mesopotamian archaeology.
Was there ever a dig? Did you go out and do a first dig? Can you tell me about the first time you did that sort of work?
Yeah. So the first time I actually did an excavation was in Germany. Was on a Celtic settlement.
Oh.
Yeah, because I thought before I really embark on studying archaeology, I should at least know what it's like and what it entails. And so I wrote to the local cultural research management institution that we have in Germany, and they gave me they basically took me on, and so I worked for 3 months on an excavation in Germany on a Celtic settlement. It was very boring. We didn't find anything.
But it didn't kill your interest, though, did it?
It didn't kill my interest. It should have, because they found the most exciting stuff after I left. But then actually I went on my first dig in Syria after my first semester at university, so very early, and that was obviously fantastic.
So I have to learn how you got from Berlin to Vienna to Bayside, Queens. Tell us a little bit about your education trajectory and how you ended up at Queensborough.
So I got my master's degree. Well, so the situation was this. I was actually in Berlin, and I thought actually I would do my MA there as well, but we had a vacancy of a position that was simply not filled. And so I had to find other ways to get my master's or an advisor for my master's.
Right.
And I had already really an interest in irrigation and realized I really should look at these texts. They're really interesting. So because I did work also on Sumerian texts on irrigation for a different area than I did for my dissertation. And so I found in Vienna there was someone that was interested in that topic. So that was the reason why I then went to Vienna to get my master's degree. And Leiden, or the Netherlands, that was basically an exchange program that Berlin had with Leiden University. But the thing was that I always really looked towards the US, because in the US, archaeology is always integrated into the Department of Anthropology. So it's much more about social theory. And I found it always very interesting and inspiring, and I liked what scholars from the US wrote and how they approached things. And so I had always an interest to come here to continue my study. First, I wanted to do an exchange. It didn't work out. My English was too bad.
It's gotten better.
And then I applied for a PhD, and I thought, and I came to Stony Brook because my advisor, Elizabeth Stone, and there was someone else at that point at the university, Jennifer Pornell. They already did remote sensing, so interpreting satellite imagery to understand irrigation, to detect ancient canals, ancient rivers. So I knew if I really wanted to do something on ancient irrigation or ancient water management, this is the place to go. And Elizabeth Stone also had a very strong background in both archaeology and textual analysis. So she was very, I think, a good advisor in understanding why I wanted to do that. And that's how I came to Stony Brook. And I did my PhD here, and that's also where I got a lot of anthropology. So I did enjoy that quite a bit as well. I worked as a teaching assistant for cultural anthropology, so I was exposed a lot to, modern ethnographies that are indeed also really relevant at times for us to understand a data set that's often or almost always incomplete. After I got my PhD at Stony Brook, I did get this fellowship in Chicago.
You teach at Queensborough. What do your students think about your work?
I do an introduction to ancient civilizations, and obviously it's very clear that there's a lot of examples from Mesopotamia. And I do a little introduction at the beginning of class where I say what I do in terms of research. And I use it as a teaching moment for them to understand how we use, for example, pottery. That I go on satellite imagery, that I identify potential archaeological sites, that I go to Iraq and then collect the surface, and then I show them a few examples of like what I find, and then how I use a pottery typology to date the occupation of a specific settlement, because pottery is very, let's say, malleable, and so you have real changes in styles through time, and the changes in styles is what we date, and these styles obviously is recognizable. When I find a piece that is of a certain style, I know it dates to either 5000 BC or 4000 BC or 2000 BC, and so I think they enjoy. I hope they enjoyed it, but I think they do.
Well, you certainly bring history alive. I think it's such a wonderful opportunity that students have to work with someone who's in the field and who's actively doing research. It's a great compliment to the undergraduate research program that Queensborough has. Who inspired you to do this work? Where did you find your inspiration? Was there a particular teacher or a professor or a family member that really mentored you and showed you the way?
There was definitely one. He was my MA advisor, and he was at the time a visiting professor at Berlin University, Arnold Hausleiter, and he was just an incredibly good mentor, and he taught a class on water management, and that's when I really got into it. And I think that it was irrigation that fascinated me. It probably goes back a little bit to my background coming from a farm. I grew up on a farm in southern Germany, and I think that I was very in tune with agricultural cycles, with agricultural work. And irrigation was particularly fascinating to me because there's so much cooperation involved. People have to work with each other in order to maintain the canals, to distribute the water. There has to be rules. And it's kind of a small social cosmos of the larger society. And I think that's what I found so fascinating about it. And I think I had a better in because I was from a farm, and I knew the life cycles. And then I think the, so to say, evolution is like that. Now I'm really interested in economies, because agriculture is basically the foundation of ancient economies. And so I feel that the work that I'm doing now, where I reconstruct basically the geographic context of these early economies, that's what I want to do. So because that we can describe a really early economy for which we don't have much information in other cases, because they were capable of supporting state-level societies with social differentiation, with urbanism, all you can think of, labor division. But there had to be an economy that was capable of providing for all of that. And we have a really hard time really describing that. But I think the case that I'm working on has the potential to do that. So this is basically the long shot. And I think I will probably take the focus on agriculture.
I know that you want to get back to Iraq soon. I don't know when travel restrictions will be lifted and when you'll be able to go. But what are your upcoming plans? How long is this current phase of your research going to continue?
The plan is to go back this winter, because the thing is that we cannot go during the summer. It's just simply too hot. And because we're out in the field, the time that we could be out would be just too short. So I usually plan seasons in the winter break, and that's what I'm planning to do this winter if it's possible. And so the first two seasons that we had in 2018, we did survey 18 sites, which is not bad for the time that we had. But this is basically a real initial phase where we already, we have a good set of data, but we also see kind of what we have to change. And one thing is that I definitely have to take a bigger team. So this winter, what we want to do, I got a grant from the Gerda Henkel Foundation in Germany for this project, and that will allow me to take a photographer and an illustrator, because I have a collaborator who's a pottery specialist, but the two of us, and then I work also with 3 local archaeologists, we were working like mad people to finish everything in time, because basically we have to draw, photograph, record everything before we leave the field. And as it always happens, on the last day of the field season, like not the last day, but the last day in the field, we found this amazing site that had so many artifacts. And so we were just like basically almost like, I think there was like 4 days or so where I slept no more than 4 hours just to get it done. And we realized, okay, in the future, we have to take people like a photographer and an illustrator that can do that work in the house while we do the field work. So this is the future plan.
What does the illustrator bring to the site? Because if you have a photographer and you're videotaping and so forth, why do you need an illustrator?
Sorry, yeah, okay, I'm talking too much in archaeological terms. So basically, everything that you find, also like what we find, the pottery pieces that we pick up, we draw them. So we draw them like it's basically technical drawing. You make a drawing of it that is a 1-to-1, so that you have a record of it, and then you also take a photograph, a picture of it, because all that material stays in Iraq. You cannot take it out for analysis.
Oh.
So our analysis is based on the records that we produce or the drawings that we produce. And also it's standard that you make drawings, and then based on these drawings, then when you publish, that is what you publish. You make a drawing of a piece of pottery and then reconstruct it, what kind of vessel it was originally. And the same you do also with small finds.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of obviously the pieces are they're pieces. Do you find many things that are intact?
Few, but we do.
Yeah.
We do actually. And the reason why we do more than probably ever is because there's a huge problem with looting in Iraq. I mean, it made the news somewhat here in the recent years, and it is fairly widespread. So every site has looting holes, and that obviously brings out artifacts, because they only take what is valuable and probably complete. We don't know for sure, because we obviously don't know what came out of the ground. Mm-hmm. But around it, you find a lot of artifacts that you would otherwise not have.
Well, I look forward to seeing more pictures from your next trip, and to talk to you when you come back. I guess in the spring next year after your winter trip. And I'm thrilled to know about your work, and so happy to meet you. And I've enjoyed our conversation so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.